Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the first online event of our Krasno Global Affairs series here at the University of North Carolina in very sunny Chapel Hill. I hope you're all well and healthy and safe in these days of global crisis and economic turmoil. I'm Klaus Lares, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC-Chapel Hill. I started organizing the Krasno Global Affairs series in 2012. And since then, we have had over 100 events on global politics, economics, and security affairs with very interesting and distinguished speakers. You can watch all of these events on our YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. As I like to say, you don't want to miss any of these events. They all make exciting viewing. And I can also recommend the separate 5-minute interviews I conduct with all our speakers. They are also on our YouTube channel. We also have a website which is worth looking at. That is krasnoevents.com. And we have a global mailing list. Please send me an email if you wish to join our mailing list. There's also a contact form on our webpage, or write simply an email to me at lares@unc.edu. Very easy to do. I'm more than happy to include you in our global mailing list. Today is our first online event ever, and it is about a most important topic. It is the topic Global Nightmare, the impact of the corona crisis on the United States, China, and Europe. We have 5 distinguished speakers who will talk to us about different aspects of the global crisis. Professor Dianne Kirby is joining us live from the UK. And Professor Manlio Cinalli is joining us live from Milan in Italy. Professor Yanzhong Huang joins us from New York, the epicenter of the corona crisis in the United States. And Kaiser Kuo, Lisa Gralinski, and I are all in Chapel Hill, but at different locations here. We are all socially distancing, of course. I will introduce each of the speakers briefly before they give their short initial presentations. The procedure today is as follows. We will start with short presentations of each of our 5 speakers. Then I will have a couple of questions for each of them. After that, as always, we'll open it up to questions from you, the audience. And our global audience are both students and scholars, as well as many members of the global general public. Please submit your questions in writing by using the chat function. Senior Krasno assistant Will Yoder will select your questions and read them out for the speakers to answer. And in a little while, Will Yoder will also come on and actually explain to you how to use the chat function of this system. Please be so kind to also mention your name and if you have an affiliation when you write down a question for our speakers. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. I hope this procedure sounds okay to you. Let's begin with our first speaker. Professor Lisa Gralinski is assistant professor in the Dept of Epidemiology at UNC-Chapel Hill. In her research, she explores the interaction of human coronaviruses with the host immune system to discover virus and/or host proteins for antiviral therapeutics. Right now, with the current crisis, Lisa is extremely busy, and we are very fortunate that she was able to join us today. Today, Lisa will talk to us about the prospects for finding a vaccine against the coronavirus, and also what about the existing medications? Are there any medications available already which she can possibly use against the virus? Lisa, over to you.
Thank you. So as Klaus mentioned, I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health. But really, I think of myself as a virologist. That's my training. So I've been working on human coronaviruses for about 10 years. And so my awareness of this, new coronavirus outbreak is probably a little bit different than a lot of other people's. I was traveling with my husband in Guatemala over New Year's, and some of the science writers that I follow on Twitter started suddenly chatting about, hey, there's this cluster of atypical pneumonia in Wuhan. This seems like something we've seen before with other coronaviruses, and that kind of piqued my interest. Messages started going back and forth with other lab mates, colleagues who used to be in the lab, different coronavirus researchers around the US. And so really from the get-go in January, we were kind of made aware of this. And then around January 10th, the first coronavirus sequence came out of China after the government finally confirmed that indeed this atypical pneumonia was being caused by a novel coronavirus. At that point, our laboratory here really kind of sprung into high gear, trying to think about ways that we would be able to respond to what was then just a small outbreak. But having worked with coronaviruses for years, we were very attuned to the fact that they are poised to emerge into human populations, to spill over from animal species such as bats. And so it wasn't a big surprise to us that a coronavirus would emerge, would have the ability to spread from human to human. There was a question for a number of weeks about whether or not human-to-human transmission was occurring, but indeed it definitely was, and has continued to transmit far more than any of us could have ever guessed. So back in January, we started stocking up on supplies, ordering constructs expressing different virus proteins, trying to rebuild the virus so that we could have an infectious clone in our laboratory here in Chapel Hill, where we work in BSL-3 laboratories, and it's all with high containment work, all approved by our EHS committees on campus. But what can we start to understand about this coronavirus? Our laboratory had previously worked with SARS and MERS coronaviruses, looking at what existing human drugs might be able to prevent disease there. So we had a lot of background knowledge about mouse models. We'd worked with REM Desapear in partnership with Gilead Scientific. We've also worked with George Painter's group at Emory University, looking at EIDD 1931, another drug that's broadly efficacious against human coronaviruses of all varieties that we've tested. So those were our first efforts, stuff we were able to respond most rapidly to. Since that time, we've been working on developing animal models so that we can understand the course of disease, so that we can have an animal in which to more effectively test these therapeutics. It's one thing to be able to stop virus replication in some cells in a plate in the lab. It's another thing to show that you're able to protect from the development of respiratory disease. We want to understand the host immune response, to understand if it's a long-lived response, if it's going to be protective. Along that line, we're working with the NIH and Moderna vaccines to do animal studies looking at the protective effect of the Moderna vaccine that started going into human trials in Seattle and also in Florida back in March. We're working with a number of academic and corporate partners looking at repurposing existing human drugs, cancer drugs that structural modeling might predict would have a function against the new coronavirus, working with people developing monoclonal antibodies or collecting hyperimmune serum from infected patients to be able to look at antibody type therapies. So when we think about all of these therapeutics, a lot of them are directly targeting the virus when it replicates, and that's what remdesivir does. And so remdesivir is what we call a nucleoside analog, where it tricks the virus replication proteins into thinking that it's, in this case, the adenosine, the A, in the nucleotide sequence, but it's not, and that stops, it's called a chain terminator, it stops replication of the virus transcript. And so that's how remdesivir functions to stop coronavirus and other RNA virus replication. As such, we think remdesivir will work if human trials are conducted appropriately. With all of the human coronaviruses that cause severe disease, virus replication happens kind of under the radar at the beginning in the host, and then people start to develop an immune response, they become symptomatic. But by the time someone has developed really severe lung disease, that's not so much due to the virus replicating anymore, it's more due to the host immune response causing a lot of inflammation, a lot of immunopathology in the lung. And so patients who are really at this end stage of disease or really in critical care, stopping virus replication at that point isn't the answer to their problems. It's more stopping an out of control human immune response. So when we're looking at the trials that are happening with remdesivir in COVID-19 patients in both the US and in China, we're hoping that they're treating patients early enough that the drug really has a chance to work. If you wait until someone is, in really, really critical condition where their disease has progressed for weeks at this point, it's pretty unlikely that remdesivir is going to be able to function and to help them out. Chloroquine has come up a lot in the news recently. That's not one that we're working with. It's definitely a drug that all of us here are pretty skeptical about. The mechanism by which it would work to treat COVID-19 patients and improve their outcome is pretty questionable. It is kind of a broadly anti-inflammatory agent, so that mechanism could make a little bit of sense, but when people talk about it inhibiting virus replication, that seems unlikely to be the case. You know, as scientists, we're used to being wrong a lot of the time. That's how the scientific process works. You test something and then you change your hypothesis depending on the answer. We would be kind of delighted to be wrong if chloroquine does work out because it could help a lot of people. But the idea of just broadly giving this drug to thousands and thousands of patients without considering their background health status, the side effects that this drug can cause, and without having a real clear answer for why we think it would work, that is maybe not the best idea in my mind. And then for the vaccine, it's gone into people in the US more rapidly than I think any other vaccine trial has ever happened. The platform is relatively untested. However, it does allow for this kind of rapid response, which is really urgently needed in a pandemic situation. So far in lab, it seems like it could be promising. It's very early days of testing and we're still working out our model systems. But we haven't heard reports of any ill effects with the initial cohorts where it's just safety testing. And we hope to have enough preclinical data to allow the NIH and Moderna to go forward with phase 2 and phase 3 trials over the summer and fall like they're hoping to. So right now in lab, we're busy with all sorts of tissue culture work, looking at primary cells, looking at mice, trying to understand how these vaccines work, the antivirals that I mentioned, and more drugs that are being suggested to us by different pharmaceutical partners, and trying to understand the basic biology of this virus. Is it susceptible to the host innate immune response? Could you perhaps treat with interferon? How do the virus proteins interact with host proteins? Really all aspects of virus infection are under study in the lab at this point. And in terms of, you know, how things are going with containing spread in the US and, you know, if we're going to be able to ease up on social distancing measures anytime soon, I would say, you know, I agree with Dr. Fauci. We need to let the virus lead that decision. And right now the virus says absolutely not. We need to keep working on a pretty closed down campus here at UNC. We have a lot of excellent support from facilities, from security, from EHS. So our reduced group is here working as hard as possible. And we hope that everyone else stays home and stays safe.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Just a quick question. Is there any global cooperation going on between your lab at UNC and other labs in the US or beyond the US?
We are working with so many you know, previous collaborators in the US and a whole host of new collaborators. And we are definitely, you know, I don't think we've established any new formal collaborations with international researchers, but we're definitely, you know, discussing progress with them and kind of just checking in to see how different groups are doing, trying to keep abreast of what's happening in different laboratories so that we can all make the best use of our time as possible and not just repeat efforts that are, you know, being effectively used somewhere else. We don't need to have two groups doing the same type of study when there's so much we need to know about this new virus.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Is Yanzhong Huang there? Has he shown up in the meantime?
Yes, he's here.
All right, great. That is our next speaker. Right. Professor Yanzhong Huang is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. At the council, he directs the Global Health Governance Roundtable series. He's also professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton University. And he will talk to us today about the situation in the United States and also the developing situation in China. Over to you, Yanzhong.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this event. Well, I think with only 10 minutes, it's kind of hard to talk about two countries. Although, you know, you could easily point out the pattern response seems to be quite similar. If you look at China first, we know that the outbreak could be traced to November. Actually, the first case, we call the index case, was identified November 17th. But China's initial response to the COVID-19, we know that was characterized with cover-up and inaction at the local level in particular, right? Because in the early January, in particular, there are already healthcare workers being infected, which constitutes smoking gun evidence of a human-to-human transmission. But apparently, there were no decisive efforts being undertaken by the local government. And that, of course, transformed the disease from a small outbreak to a full-blown epidemic, then the pandemic, and indeed it constitutes probably the worst political social crisis for the Chinese leadership since the Tiananmen crisis in 1989. So at that time, it looked as if the Chinese leaders, President Xi in particular, were going to emerge from the crisis with their legitimacy, their governance capacity being badly damaged, and their long-standing ambitions to achieve international leadership also dramatically undercut because of that mishandling of the initial outbreak. And then also people are talking about China's Chernobyl moment, and how this is going to usher in a new era of political reform or even regime demise. But then, in a very strange twist of events, that you found that the Chinese leaders not only muddle through the crisis, but also they are not claiming leadership on both domestic and international fronts in combating the COVID-19. So first of all, after January 20th, when the government realized something has to be done decisively and effectively, they launched the drastic, if you will, draconian containment measures, right? Lockdown Wuhan, and essentially convert the entire country, right, into I hate to use this term, basically like lock down the entire country. That will mass social distancing measures being announced. They also have the people enforcing those containment measures. And these measures actually have been turned out to be effective in bringing down the cases in a very short period of time. We know that yesterday, April 8th, the government actually lifted the lockout on Wuhan, the COVID-19 epicenter, which is, might be a symbolic move, but it shows that there's at least a temporary China won this war on COVID-19. And that this China's containment measures and were touted as an effective model for containing the pandemic. In fact, we were initially talking about South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, even Japan, sort of offering an alternative, a viable alternative, right, to China's model of this COVID-19 containment. But just yesterday, we've seen that even in those countries, they have seen the resurge of the cases, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and in Japan. And they have to now actually tighten their containment measures, which makes those measures more similar to the China's. So the Chinese model now is being showing as a very the most effective model in a way to containing the spread of the virus. We saw that it was happening also in the Western countries, right? Italy, I'm sure Professor Cinalli is going to talk about that. The United States, initially we were thinking, well, while it is important to maximize, health, protecting people's lives, but in the meantime, we also need to avoid too much disruption to the economy and society. It turned out that it's very hard to find a balance. Eventually, well, actually, you're moving the balancing point more toward the side of maximizing protection of people's health. And so that is one development. And secondly, we found that in the West, including Europe and the United States, right, leaders of many of those liberal democracies actually confront the similar pressures to China in terms of downplaying the threat of the outbreak, in terms of not being able to effectively respond to the crises in a timely, right, in a manner. I'm not going to further elaborate that, but essentially, the Chinese leaders could easily point to what is going on in the West to say, look at them, right? They're not as effective as ours in containing the spread of the virus. They are actually the same pattern of downplaying the crises, lack of effective response could be observed in Western democracies too, right? And then we found that those so-called political window, right, triggered by Dr. Li Wenliang's death in early February was also closed, right? Because for a time, when you have so many people mourning Dr. Li's death, have so many people they actually express their anger, their frustration through the Chinese Weibo. That night, there's 800 million comments, at the night of Dr. Li's death. But then what was followed was not talking about drawing lessons, reforming the political system. It was actually a crackdown on the social media. And in fact, nowadays, if you just look at those this official rhetoric, statements, all those talks about, transparency, political change was actually gone. So that political window also has been closed. And in the meantime, we have seen sort of a disinformation effort, portraying the U.S. as a potential origin of the outbreak, and even suggest the U.S. military being the potential cause of the outbreak. That actually was, I think, it was quite successful in deflecting the blame for the initial mishandling of the outbreak in Wuhan. So actually, according to the Chinese celebrity blogger Cui Yongyuan, only 12% of the nearly 10,000 Chinese respondents in the survey believe that COVID-19 was a natural occurring outbreak. So this is a lot of people indeed believe this kind of conspiracy theories. So that combined with this attacks on the Western countries' inaction and incompetence, actually managed to also boost the nationalism, which is an important pillar of the political legitimacy in China. And finally, the pandemic appears to have also accelerated Beijing's efforts to assert claim to global leadership, right? Through the so-called mask diplomacy, right? That China has sent the PPEs, personal protection equipment, diagnostic kits, even doctors, to 82 countries around the world, right? So, that was in sharp contrast to President Trump's American First approach, right? So we haven't seen essentially U.S. being lending a helping hand to any other countries. Instead, we're seeing the U.S. trying to, for example, to acquire this vaccine making in Germany to have exclusive access to the vaccine. So you have seen, all these developments. This is a very remarkable twist of events. That we see the Chinese leaders not only muddle through the crisis, but also emerge as a leader on both domestic and foreign policy front. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Yanzhong. Quick question, what about the future of Chinese-American relations? Will they be better or a lot worse than they were before the crisis? And they were not good at all.
Well, currently there seems to be some signs that they're improving their relationship after President Trump and President Xi spoke with each other on the phone. But I don't know whether there was just like because they need each other, so they cut a deal. And certainly our president is very good at doing that transaction thing. But I think that fundamentally this kind of mistrust, lack of trust, that also that this kind of misperception, this kind of this deterioration of the political relationship being caused by this power shift between the two countries, I don't think it can be eliminated by the pandemic. And indeed, we at least until very recently, we've seen that pandemic has not brought the two countries to work together to fighting a common enemy. Instead, we're seeing all this, two countries being finger pointing, blaming each other, they attacking each other. So that is certainly does not bode well for the future of U.S.-China relations.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Dianne Kirby. She is a visiting professor in history at Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. Previously, she was an associate professor at the University of Ulster in the UK. And Dianne and I go back a long time. Once upon a time, we were colleagues in Belfast, and she definitely was an outstanding colleague. Today, Dianne will talk to us about the developing situation in both the UK and Ireland, and perhaps also about the fate of Prime Minister Johnson. Over to you, Dianne.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My observations of the crisis are those of a historian, mindful of the past and wary of predicting the future. Responses in Britain and Ireland pretty much resemble responses elsewhere. Governments trying to show strength and leadership, but all too often delivering chaos and confusion. At the grassroots level, there is tremendous fear, accompanied by humbling acts of courage on the part of the many, tainted by the reckless behaviour and opportunism of a few. For the media, it is a feeding frenzy that reflects all its inherent contradictions. Responsible coverage versus sensationalism. Support the government at a time of national crisis versus indict it for misguided policies and incompetence. Reassure the public that all is under control versus stark examples of how it is anything but. Presently, horror stories from haggard-looking, fearful National Health Service workers about lack of protection and preparedness are reported, as are the efforts to silence, discipline, and even dismiss NHS workers who speak out despite drastic staff shortages. There is presently a growing realization that government claims that no state could be prepared are untrue. Well before this pandemic, both the British and Irish governments were alerted to the dangers represented to human immunity by viral pathogens. In Britain, Labour and Tory governments alike adopted a course of mitigation, accepting deadly disease could spread, that intensive care provision would be inadequate, but that losses would be bearable. That was certainly the course initially pursued by the Boris Johnson administration, although it has since denied it ever adhered to a policy of herd immunity. Initially, it was assumed victims would largely be the elderly and the vulnerable, seen by some insiders as draining the public exchequer. Revelations about government advisors with racist and eugenic views heightened public concern. Notably, the Prime Minister, previously dismissive of experts and once criticised as lazy and light on detail, appeared at his daily conferences flanked by scientific and medical specialists, insisted they guided his policy. The key factor leading to the switch from herd immunity to lockdown was public opinion. Populist Boris was forced to follow public demand for government action. Tory inaction, accompanied by Churchillian wartime rhetoric, opened the door to press criticism. Recalling the collective revulsion enshrined in the memory of lions led by donkeys, the press implied a government betrayal of the British public akin to the carnage inflicted on British troops by the inadequate leadership of World War I generals. At present, of course, Boris is depicted as a hero who disregarded his own health to ensure that of the country he loves. He has become the indispensable leader, and the press agonizes over constitutional questions and the hole at the heart of government. As his current health prognosis, he's just left hospital, he's just left intensive care, suggests recovery rather than martyrdom, it is likely that once he has resumed his leadership role, the press will yet again refer to bungling Boris with his slogan mantras, floundering around out of his depth. Today, along with a host of others identified as at risk, I received a letter from Boris on Downing Street headed paper that unintentionally highlighted the tragic ironies of the current crisis, especially government emphasis on national unity and British spirit. COVID-19 struck a country still deeply and bitterly divided by the Brexit process. Boris came to office promising to heal the wounds, but was singularly ill-equipped to do so given his own role. The British spirit invoked by his Brexit campaign was infused with a narrow and mean-spirited nationalism that questioned the patriotism, the Britishness, if you will, of those who wanted to remain in Europe. Equally tragic, he contributed to a racist Brexiteer discourse, supplemented by Tory policies that not only promoted fear of migrants and Muslims, but negativity toward British Black and minority ethnics who had lived and worked in the country for generations. Ironically, the whole country is now witness to how migration has enriched and strengthened the country, constituting a critical component of its essential infrastructure, the National Health Service above all. The first 4 doctors to die were non-white, as have been many of the other doctors and nurses since to die on the front line in the service of the nation. The NHS, decimated and fragmented by Tory cuts and privatisation policies, rendered woefully unprepared and still ill-equipped, saved the Prime Minister's life. The Downing Street letter refers to NHS workers as being, and I quote, truly inspirational and rising magnificently to the needs of the hour. Yet they still lack protective equipment and daily risk their own lives and those of their families. Black and minority ethnics are also heavily represented in some of the most poorly paid jobs. Those that COVID-19 has shown are vitally important to the nation's survival. Now, designated key workers, refuse collectors, bus drivers, checkout and store assistants, delivery drivers and postal workers, the most poorly paid, are now the most exposed as they keep the country going. Hopes are being raised of a kinder, fairer, more equitable society emerging from the crisis. At the end of March, Boris, moved by the overwhelming response to the national call for retired doctors and nurses to return to the NHS front line, along with hosts of volunteer helpers, declared, "One thing I think the coronavirus has already proved is that there really is such a thing as society." It appeared a deliberate repudiation of Margaret Thatcher's 1987 endorsement of pure individualism, when, declaring there is no such thing as society, she encapsulated the neoliberalism that has proven so destructive of British society. However, Other voices from the libertarian free market position usually occupied by Boris are promoting a debate that argues the lockdown cure and the economic impact on society will cause more damage than the virus. At the forefront of this debate are Tory grandees, newly lamenting the plight of the poor. Those living in cramped quarters, unable to access parks, prone to depression and at risk of suicide, forced to stay at home with violent partners. These voices are the same ones usually calling for cutting to the bone services to the poor, reducing mental health services and closing refuges for battered women. They have long been the beneficiaries of neoliberal policies that exponentially increased Britain's rich-poor divide, causing soaring levels of poverty and homelessness. And what about Northern Ireland? Well, not even a global pandemic has been able to bridge the sectarian divide at Stormont, the Northern Ireland seat of government. Indeed, it has but served to fuel what us living here call the political blame game. In fairness to the five-party power-sharing executive, governments the world over are struggling to cope with the crisis. Plus, it is peculiarly handicapped. Only 3 months in power after a 3-year absence, the executive have but recently been exonerated of corruption, much to the surprise of the general public, following a financial scandal that has burdened the public purse with astronomical liabilities for decades to come. A public inquiry decided that the evidence showed not corruption, but staggering incompetence. Fortunately, people in Northern Ireland are pretty resilient. 3 years without government, not to mention 30 years of conflict, has led to strong community bonds and networks. Once the pandemic is over, the people in Britain and Ireland may well find that grassroots level is where real leadership and hope resides. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Dianne. What about the Republic of Ireland? What's the situation there?
I think the Republic is in exactly the same position as Britain and the rest of the European countries. It's a lot of trial and error, and precisely as the previous speaker was saying, people are aware of the propaganda value that they need to look good. They've got to be re-elected. They need to always project a confidence about what they're doing.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to our next speaker. And our next speaker is based in Italy. That is Professor Manlio Cinalli. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Milan in Italy. He's also an associate research director at Sciences Po in Paris, France. And for many years, he also was a research professor at Sciences Po. Manlio and I also go back quite some time. Many years ago, he was a PhD student and I was a junior lecturer at Queen's University, Belfast. And that's almost 200 years ago, I would say. Today, Manlio will talk to us about the situation in Italy and whether or not Italy is flattening the curve. And he will also talk about Italy's growing disappointment with perhaps a lack of help from the EU and other European countries. Over to you, Manlio.
Okay, thank you very much, Klaus, for also for your nice words about our shared past. The situation in Italy, well, I think that there has been lots of lights on the Italian scenario recently. So it's obvious to many parties and to everybody how the country has been so badly hit by the coronavirus death, a very high death rate. At the moment, we have nearly 20,000 people who have been died. Then another thing that probably we should emphasize somewhere is that statistics are not so clear, and it's always a bit difficult to make comparisons across countries. But let's say that the official deaths are approximately 18,000 something, so they approximate the nearly 20,000, with about 150,000 people being classified as contagious. The good news is that in the last week, in fact, we have basically hit a sort of plateau. It's always very sad to talk in this kind of cynical way with these figures, but basically until last week, we were traveling at a speed of about 1,000 deaths per day. And now we are traveling at something like 500 per day. So the figure has been halved. Although today, this is just the data that have been released by the minister just a few hours ago. At 6 p.m. in Italy, every day, there is actually the direct on the television and with the authorities, and the authorities, they release all the official figures. So today, the official figures, they reveal actually that there is a good increase because basically there are 610 deaths more than yesterday, and yesterday were more on the 500. So it's very difficult to understand where we are exactly. It's a very difficult situation because I think that in the imaginario of people, there is the idea that there would be a curve, and then you would hit a peak, and then you would start to descend. The experience here at the moment is that there was a peak, but we are we reached the plateau, as we say in French language. And now we've been in the plateau for quite a time, and I think that people are growing anxious about the possibility that the plateau is going to last a long time. And obviously the situation is very bad from the very sad human effort and human costs the country is enduring. But as you can imagine, the country has been shut for 1 month now. And when you hit the plateau and for 1 week, nothing changes, obviously the country is now thinking and talking about being prepared to be locked for a very long time, which basically means facing huge economic costs. And with this last point, I actually can link to your second point, Klaus, about what is the situation with Europe, because it's really about the huge economic cost that the country now is prepared to face. This is actually has become the major point of discordia, of argument, of contentiousness that is actually rising in Europe at the moment. So the situation, we should remind maybe that the situation in Italy is as bad as in other countries, because in the last week, as we know, Spain started to grow in numbers and with dramatic figures. And in fact, today, the number of deaf people and contagiousness is higher in Spain than in Italy. But at the same time, also in France. France today went over the 10,000 deaths. And in fact, there is also a very peculiar way by which figures are calculated or not in France, because France calculates only the death in the hospitals. But then there are so many deaths taking places in the hospices, in private houses, and so they calculate that perhaps there should be something like 3,000-5,000 extra casualties. But France is also in the same position, and this has brought, and here I come to the second point you were raising, this has brought a huge contentious issue in Europe about the, Corona bonds, Euro bonds. So basically the idea that perhaps Europe should formulate a type of government bond at European level, which would be something that would allow to balance the notorious financial instability and lower credibility of some countries, like Italy in particular and Spain, on the one hand, to balance this with the high credibility that other countries, in particular Germany, has. So the idea that we could have a government bonds at the European level is something that has been seen, particularly in Italy, but also in other countries like France and Spain, as something that could be the solution. And on the other hand, this is not being seen as a solution in other capitals and in other governments, in particular in Germany, in the Netherlands, we are assisting that. And this is a very tricky point that now, in just 3 minutes I'm left with time, I have to explain. So basically, Italy is at the center of a European row by which the whole European institutional framework is actually in huge danger. And it's a very tricky and very sad and cynical game that unfortunately is being played by the extreme rights in different parts of Europe. Because basically in Italy, there is the idea that the government should not accept nothing less from the other Nordic countries than the government bonds at the European level. So we want the European bonds and that's it. Anything less weakens tremendously the government, the Italian government in power, like the French government, like the Spanish government, because the extreme right is there to say that any kind of conditionality that will be introduced to receive some kind of loan or some kind of help, well, that will be a big defeat. That will be just about the big Nordic countries having defeat on the southern countries. This is the extreme right in the southern countries. On the other hand, the Nordic countries are completely in the same game, although with an opposite dynamic, because the extreme right in the Nordic countries actually threatens the government in place by saying anything you give to the South more than a conditional help, that's going to be something too much. And there are countries like the Netherlands, for example, which is emerging at the moment as the toughest country. Germany is probably trying to find a compromise, particularly in their, let's say, renewed relationship with the French. So they're trying to find out something, some compromise between the Nordic and the Southern version. But say that the Dutch government took 7 months in 2017, the election, and the Liberals, led by Rutte, they needed 7 months to do the government. Why? Because and finally they could do a government of coalition with all kind of other conservatives, and because they're strongly threatened by the extreme right. So now, for example, in the last day, just today, there is this big opposition between Rutte and his Minister of Finance against the Gualtieri, who is the minister in Italy. And this is the biggest contraposition between, yes, let's do the Eurobonds, let's not do it. And basically, the Dutch government is hostage in the extreme right, because if they accept anything that goes towards the Eurobond, so to this kind of government bonds at European level, well, the extreme right is just there to actually hit the government and perhaps take in the power. So it's, and here I come and I finish, because this is my time is finishing. This is just to say that the coronavirus is started as a health and human problem and has continued in an economic problem, because there are countries that they program to have a decrease in the GDP approximately of 10-15%. This would be the condition in Italy or in Spain, and has continued to grow into a huge political problem, which could actually undermine this time, once for all, the whole European institutional framework. So I'll stop here because this is my 10 minutes.
Thanks very much, Manlio. Tell us briefly and quickly, why did Italy suffer so many infections, so many mortalities, more than in many other countries?
Well, it's very difficult to say. Well, first of all, because I'm not an epidemiologist. So, but the major idea that I got out of all the information that I try to assimilate these days is that it's a real problem of statistics to understand what's going on in these countries. Of course, it's not a problem only of statistics, but it's very possible that those data for Italy, actually, they are not really transparent, in the sense that it's very possible that there are actually millions of people with big contagions. So whenever you match the mortality of 18,000, 20,000 people, if you match it with the number of contagious people that have been recorded, it seems a huge mortality. But if you match it with a much bigger and larger potential number of people who are being contagious, they will be different. This is one part. The second part is that, unfortunately, the same sort of game that we heard also previously about cutting down health expenses and cutting down public budgets, particularly for, as we know, education universities, but health. And in this case, well, this meant that the situation in Italy is completely different, say, from Germany, Germany is a country that as a basis start is starting with if I'm not wrong with the data, it's 28,000 places in hospital beds for intensive care. And this is just about the basic starting operation, which basically means that the country can reorganize other kind of parts of hospitals and so on, and possibly double the number. Italy started with less than a quarter of that. So that changes completely the perspective. So basically in Italy, as we don't know, that's also a bit tricky to understand from the news, but in Italy, a sort of triage, unfortunately, was a scenario that became real because there were not enough beds to actually treat everybody. And so unfortunately, what happened is that the country was hit badly from a big contagious cycle, and this was a sort of unlucky, you know. But on the other hand, the country has been responsible for not arriving at this appointment, at this challenge, with the same health that other countries have, Germany first of all.
Thank you very much, Manlio. Let's come to our next speaker and also our final speaker, that is Kaiser Kuo. Kaiser Kuo is editor-at-large of subchina.com and host of the Sinica Podcast. I can recommend the Sinica Podcast to you most warmly. There are weekly discussions of current affairs in China, and they are the leading podcast on contemporary China. And they are in English, actually. Kaiser Kuo is one of America's most knowledgeable and well-known experts on China. Luckily, he lives in Chapel Hill and has become a great supporter and contributor to the Grasno Global Events series. Kaiser will talk to us today about the situation in the United States and above all about the politics of China and of how the country tries to deal with the corona crisis, both domestically and globally. Over to you, Kaiser.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Here in the United States, and actually I'm going to focus most of my comments about China in the American discourse, China seems to come up in every discussion about COVID-19, if not as a topic of conversation, then certainly one of very bitter contention. There is, of course, as Yanzhong Huang talked about quite a bit, many questions. There are questions about China's culpability in the handling of the early reports about a new SARS-like virus by Wuhan authorities, in the way that they treated people like the ophthalmologist Li Wenliang, in others who sounded early alerts like him, in the way that they failed to report early instances of human-to-human transmission. There's also a lot of questions about the relationship between Beijing and the World Health Organization, including very recently questions raised by our president. He loudly criticized them. There were the measures that China took to contain the viruses and to prevent its spread, which struck many at the time as extreme, until suddenly those measures seemed perfectly sensible and reasonable and what we should all be emulating. There are China's claims, perhaps premature claims, of a victory in its battle with COVID-19. And really, most of this was before the disease upended lives in the United States. Since the middle of March, when the US began at last to mobilize its own resources against the virus, China has not at all disappeared from the discourse on the disease. If anything, it's really moved very much to the center of the discourse, or more to the center, even before Trump started using the phrase, the Chinese virus, in press conferences and in tweets. Many American pundits and politicians were already beating the blame China drum. Trump's language definitely fanned the flames of this. While he was no longer maybe pumping as furiously as he had been on the bellows, the conflagration that he started that he really helped to spread, at least, is now burning very much out of control and finding plenty of dry fuel to feed on. And this has been really dispiriting for me and for my family, and really anyone with straight black hair and epicantic eye folds. It's not just dispiriting, it's downright frightening. Given the pronounced increase that we've seen in violence directed against people of East Asian ethnicities, of at least verbal assaults. These hate-spewing racists seem to be coming right out of the woodwork. But this has not been surprising. We were all aware that the pandemic broke out at really a low point, at a nadir of US-China relations. Already, China was being blamed for all manner of woes. Already, the whole relationship was being framed as quite zero-sum, entirely in terms of national security. For this president and for his staunch supporters to have done otherwise, for him not to have whipped up xenophobia at this particular moment, now that would have been surprising. Now we've all been treated very suddenly to this disturbingly vivid picture of just what decoupling looks like. Supply chain disruptions, plummeting bilateral trade, travel completely curtailed, almost certainly a huge number of students who will not be coming back to American universities from the 350,000 who are studying here annually, a lot of American students who will not be going to China to study there. And I think perhaps worst of all, just this escalating pattern of recrimination, this willful incineration just undertaken by, I think, irresponsible parties on both sides of the Pacific of what little trust remained between Beijing and Washington even prior to the outbreak of this. Last night, Ian Bremmer, who is a prominent American pundit on international affairs, he tweeted, "Let's be honest, it hurts to see China sending humanitarian aid to the US and Europe." I replied in a tweet, maybe it was a little flippant, "Let's be honest, that is entirely due to hubris." But Bremmer put his finger on something there. It does hurt the pride, I think, of many Americans. It hurts them because they've had this long-held worldview, a deeply held belief in American primacy, not just economically, not just militarily, but morally, really morally. It's now a worldview that's being directly challenged. It hurts enough that many are now clamoring to refuse aid from China. Since that signal moment, really, of the financial crisis now a dozen years ago, there's been a kind of nagging declinism that has really plagued the American psyche. The anxiety at this really unfamiliar experience of facing, for the first time, really, in the lives of most people alive today, of a near peer competitor. That is not hard to understand. Whatever the psychological difficulties of the current historical moment, though, I mean, it seems blindingly obvious to me, and I hope it would seem just as obvious to any reasonable person, that there is this urgent need now to cooperate with China, especially now that we've had a glimpse of what decoupling will look like. And yet that is not what we are converging around, not here in the US, and not, I fear, uniformly in China either. Instead, we get dueling conspiracy theories, we get schadenfreude from many people in Beijing, we get callous headlines in American newspapers, and we get the unwarranted expulsion of American journalists from China. I mean, we get dismissive American skepticism about the PRC's claim to numbers, its proclamations of victory. We get a lot of "I told you so" from Beijing. We get ugly xenophobia in China. We get frightening xenophobia in the US. As I said earlier, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about what Chinese authorities knew and when they knew it. There are still some matters, though, I think that if we just stick to the timeline, that are not in dispute at all. We know that the very latest moment at which the Chinese health authorities informed the World Health Organization was December 31st. We know for a fact, undisputed, that on January 3rd, President Trump was given a briefing on this, although he didn't pay a whole lot of attention. That was 3 weeks almost before Wuhan went into lockdown on January 23rd. It just doesn't take much exercise of empathy, I think, to get a sense for what Chinese people felt during this time. I think we should all try to exercise that empathy and think about that. I mean, because for many of them, they felt like they were really going through it alone in January and February, while the rest of the world, and especially the US, whose opinions for some reason take on an outsized importance among Chinese people, they looked on like charitably as sort of unsympathetic spectators, if not indeed, cheering for the virus. One of the big design flaws, I think, in human psychology is, and maybe this is even more true for China, I don't know, is that we feel and we remember the slights, the criticisms, the insults, and the injuries more readily and maybe more deeply than the acts of compassion and the benevolence. So it was with the Chinese. I mean, they're going to remember the cruel remarks about hygiene, about eating, exotic wildlife, far more than they're going to remember the very brave, very deeply humanizing stories that were actually written from within Wuhan itself by some excellent American journalists, some of whom, ironically, have been kicked out of China. So one of the biggest questions for me, though, and really I think it's the most consequential questions in the long term, and it's one that Yanzhong, I think, deliberately left unaddressed, is this. Why did so much of the Western world just fail to act with alacrity? How could the West have just watched the disease just ravage a massive Chinese city of 11 million people, a province, Hubei province of 60 million people, sending that into lockdown, to watch it crater the world's second largest economy, and just still believe that we would be spared? Many people have offered explanations about this, and some of these, proximate causes, I think, are right, but they don't get to the deeper pathology that I am convinced underpins this society-wide failure. Yet, yes, it is primarily a failure of leadership, and here in the U.S., our notional leader, for whom reality is so often filtered through Fox News, failed to lead clearly at a critical moment. I can't speak for much experience of other Western polities, but I can talk about what I've seen here as an American. And from where I sit, as I watch this unfold, it seemed to me that even among the really highly educated, high information, plugged in worldly Americans that I am lucky enough to be friends with, very few of them appreciated the realness of what was happening. Part of this, I think, is just the invisibility of the global South. White lives in developed countries really matter, right? Brown, yellow, black lives are supposed to matter, but in fact, they only matter theoretically. The sorry fact is to most that these are just statistics that you can just sort of read. Another 50 people died in a ferry accident in Bangladesh. Part of this is just the innocence that's born, I think, of good fortune, of America's circumstances since the end of the Second World War. This manifestation, another manifestation of China, of America's much discussed exceptionalism. I mean, I think almost no American who's younger than 80, whose life was spent in the United States, has experienced anything like what they saw happening to fellow human beings in China. But another part of that exceptionalism is just the utter confidence that we have, whatever evidence may be presented to the contrary, the utter confidence we have in our political institutions, in our democracy, in our regime type. And it is because of that confidence that in thousands of arguments that I've watched or participated in, the proponent of the US and its ways, its institutions, will habitually compare Chinese realities on the one hand with American ideals. It's because we believe so strongly in our own institutions. And so it was that the outbreak, as the outbreak engulfed Wuhan, as it engulfed Hubei, our reporting tended to focus so much on China's regime type, how the failings of Chinese authoritarianism, its ostensibly communist system, were ultimately responsible somehow for COVID-19. If the coronavirus hit China because it is authoritarian, then we're going to be fine because, we're an open pluralist democracy. It does little good pointing this out to anybody who was guilty of it to begin with. I mean, more often than not, when they're confronted with this, they simply double down in that peculiarly confident way that American or democratic exceptionalism makes possible. But when all this is done, I doubt many minds will have changed at all on this point. That might not be such a bad thing. I mean, but for the fact that it makes cooperation with China, however obviously urgent that is, all the less likely because of the forces that are arrayed against it right now. The people who, despite the horrors that we're experiencing, despite, seeing what decoupling looks like now, we're still more than happy to cut off our nose to spite our face. These forces, and they tap into this deep, strangely contradictory set of wells that combine to produce these terrible choices. You have xenophobia on the one hand, but also this sort of pride in American pluralism and openness on the other. One, a very negative idea, and another quite, in other circumstances, a very positive trait. The unchallenged confidence that we have in our institutions, but also our strange contempt for science and for expertise. I think that it is a fear, it's fear really that catalyzes and brings these two things together in a particularly lethal and toxic mix. So that's all I really wanted to say. I mean, I have a lot more to say, but...
Kaiser, let me just ask you, what about the economic situation? China is opening up again, but apparently the economy is only slowly recovering. Is that correct, or how? What is your...
That is correct. I think that, look, again, people always say, don't trust Chinese numbers. I say, don't trust anybody's numbers, but They've reported the numbers of factories that have gone back to work, but a lot of those factories are not 3 shifts now. They're 1 shift. The number of workers is far less. A lot of them, in the meantime, have sort of accelerated the automation process. So I think while maybe technically accurate, you could say that X number of small and medium enterprises have returned to work. It's not the case that China's economy is back to a picture of roaring health. In the United States, I think, the really, really pessimistic projections are now to see something like a 30% contraction in our GDP. I wouldn't be surprised if China had in fact gone through something similar.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Let me say a few brief words about the German situation and then ask every speaker a few questions before we open it up to questions from the audience. I think we all want to learn answers and solutions from the crisis and lessons to be learned. And I think when we look at the German example, 3 lessons really seem to come to mind how to overcome such a situation in perhaps a little better way than has happened in many countries. And I would say the first lesson to be learned is that a united government and an efficient government and the people's trust in the government is highly important. And before the crisis, one wouldn't have thought that the grand coalition which rules in Berlin under Chancellor Merkel would actually come together so well, because they were quite divided before the crisis. But surprise, surprise, they're actually working together quite efficiently. The finance minister is an SPD person, Merkel and many others are of course from the CDU, but it doesn't seem to matter in this crisis. So I'm actually quite impressed how efficient the government machine has been able to run in Berlin. And even the Bavarian Minister President Söder, who's a fairly right of center personality from the sister party CSU, the CDU sister party CSU, has come across as a very efficient person who has taken national responsibilities, is now very high up in the opinion polls, but he has not tried to shoot from the sidelines against the coalition in Berlin. And I think that has been rewarded by the public. So any appeals by the government have actually been largely followed. Initially, perhaps not so much, but in due course, the appeals by the government have been implemented. And I think many people were surprised by that. The second lesson which the Germans learned, but which also was learned by countries such as South Korea or Singapore, for example, was early testing. As early testing as possible and as much testing as possible. And I think the Germans are now testing 100,000 a day and try to then exclude the infected people from the rest of the population by self-isolation and other means. And I think that has proven quite successful, both in the German case and also in the case, like I said, South Korea, Singapore, and other countries. And I think one of the problems with the United States is that there are not enough testing kits available to embark on that huge crusade of testing. And that has also been, I believe, the case in Italy and Spain and France, where simply, even if the will of testing is there, the ability to do so is not there because of a lack of testing kits. And I understand that the German infection rate right now is around about 130, 140,000, and the mortality rate is under 2,200 in total. That is the mortality rate which Italy and Spain have really in 3 days, which is the total German mortality rate. That really speaks for the success of testing. And the other one, of course, is the obvious lesson that a good public or private, but a good health system is highly important. And I think the Germans have cut their health system as well. There's also been an austerity drive in Germany, social security things, pension, and also the health system has suffered from that. But they haven't suffered as badly as in many other countries. For example, in the UK, what Dianne talked to us about how dire the situation with the National Health Service in the UK is because of the austerity of the government of the last few years and severe cuts. So the Germans have cut, but not quite as severely. And also they have started cutting from a higher level. So the cuts weren't as severe. As an example, for example, there are 35 intensive care beds for every 100,000 of the population in Germany. The same number is 15 in France and 5 in Ireland. And that tells you the difference in what the public health system can do. And I listened to the news last night, and it said over 700 hospitals in Germany are not at capacity at all. They have 3 beds. So if there was a wave of new corona infections, they could easily, at least at the moment, accommodate them. Only 40 hospitals were at overcapacity and 140 were running at capacity. These are extremely good numbers, particularly compared to other European countries. And then, of course, there is a European question, which Manlio answered so well already, or addressed so well already. And I firmly believe that the German government doesn't just have a responsibility for its own population, which they have fulfilled, as I tried to outline, but they also have a responsibility for their fellow European countries and people. And I think Corona bonds, as they are called, or Eurobonds, as they used to be called, are highly important. That really is the socialization of debt, at least in this crisis, that Corona bonds are being offered, which means all European countries, all EU countries take on common debt to support particularly badly suffering countries such as Italy or Spain or France or others. And I think not to do that will go down very badly, as Manlio explained to us in Italy, but also in many other countries. The finance ministers of the EU talked yesterday for 16 hours without arriving at a solution. So they are meeting again today to still arrive at a solution. And I think European solidarity requires that step. That is painful in a financial way, that may be even painful in an ideological way for many German finance experts. But I think if the EU is to survive in a pretty effective and efficient way, and if the people of Europe are to be in support of the European Union, countries such as Germany or the Netherlands or other northern countries in the EU need to show solidarity, particularly in such a crisis as now. And I think that also should be a lesson to be learned from the current crisis. That is really all I wanted to say about the German and EU situation. And I would like to come back to Lisa and ask her the question. Many countries, for example, Germany and other European countries, but also in the United States, want to go back to normalcy. They want to ease things, want to slowly go back. And there are various suggestions of how to do that, either the entire country or selected parts of the country, selected parts of the population. What do you think of that?
I think that's really, really risky. It's understandably appealing. People get bored with staying home. They want to be able to go to work, bring income in for their families, send their kids back to school. But changing things and opening up society too early is really like the worst possible option, where we've caused this massive blow to the economy kind of necessarily. But then if we open up too early, the virus will just come roaring back, and then we have the economic blow and another huge health crisis on our hands. I mean, cases in the US are still increasing by a huge number each day. That number seems fairly steady right now, but in no way is transmission under control. And my fear would be if states where there's less virus spreading, start to open up and say, okay, well, it's not so bad here. Well, that situation could change very rapidly. We still have major testing issues in areas around the country. I have friends and family members who've said like either they themselves need to get tested, their doctors, think that that's appropriate given the symptoms and where they are, or also just, anecdotally through the news and whatnot, there are not enough tests available. It can take 10, 11 days for people to get a test response back. If people aren't being, very responsible and vigilant about their own actions, in 10 or 11 days waiting to get a test result back, they could easily spread the virus to many other people. So we are just not ready yet. It's painful, but we're not ready.
And what kind of time span would you have in mind when we might be ready?
Honestly, maybe the end of April at the earliest. I would feel more comfortable with sometime in May.
Right, but at least UNC could open again in the fall.
That would be, nice to see some people around again, but it's a very quick commute into work each day right now.
And what gives us the guarantee, or if there is something like a guarantee, that there will not be a second or third wave, that we will see the same as we have recently seen?
So there really isn't a guarantee, and we're seeing that with, you know, Hong Kong and South Korea and even China to a certain extent, saying like, hey, we're seeing new cases, and these cases are not due to local transmission. Without really vigilant testing and abilities there to monitor society, you know, new cases can come in from an area that we're not watching, we're not aware, and then start whole new clusters again. Obviously, this virus is very easily transmissible, and there is some asymptomatic transmission, it seems. So until, honestly, the whole world is safe, no one is safe.
Mm-hmm. And is there something like immunity once you have had the virus in either a mild form or a harsh form, whatever?
So this is a really big question right now that's coming up a lot in Europe and to a lesser extent in the US. So traditionally, we do think that virus infection, you know, someone clears it, they develop an antibody response. This is going to include neutralizing antibodies that are going to be able to protect them from future infections. In, you know, ongoing studies of SARS-1 survivors, people found that these antibodies lasted for, you know, they started to wane after a year or two, but that they still had detectable levels of neutralizing antibody in their blood, 5, 10, in some cases even, you know, now, which is like 17 years out from when they were originally infected. But we also know that the seasonal coronaviruses that cause very mild cold-like symptoms don't result in a lasting immunity. You can get those more mild viruses over and over again, you know, kind of on an annual basis. So where this falls, we really need to find out before we start declaring people safe and free to move about. And we really aren't sure yet if someone has a more mild case of infection, you know, perhaps they're one of these asymptomatic people. Have they developed the type of antibody response that would be necessary for protection?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me ask you a selfish question. What about North Carolina? So far, we are doing relatively okay as far as I can judge. Is that going to continue like that, or are we expecting a wave of infections and mortality?
So far, we're doing pretty well, especially for being on the East Coast. You know, obviously kind of Washington, D.C. and up, very bad. Florida, pretty bad. The Atlanta area, not very good. So far, we're doing okay. Testing was very slow, but we're not a big, you know, transit center for the country or internationally, so we were fairly protected that way. You know, there's definitely big clusters by Charlotte, and you know, clusters been associated with travelers at Duke. We had at least one case on campus here at UNC, but while other states in the South have been a little bit slower to, you know, put out the stay-at-home orders or, you know, businesses being shut down, North Carolina, some of those directives came out a little bit earlier, and I think that is helping us. We also have really good healthcare facilities in our state.
So you expect that we will continue to be doing okay?
That's what I would predict. Now, this virus is kind of doing whatever it wants. We never would have guessed that it would have led to a global pandemic, so I hope I'm not surprised.
And I hope you're right. Thank you very much. Yanzhong, what about New York? Why is New York so badly affected?
Yanzhong, that one's for you.
Did you hear me?
I think you're muted right now. If you could unmute.
I'm sorry. I think one of the reasons that the New York became the epicenter of the outbreak is that it's one of the largest, is the largest cities in the US. It's very crowded. And also there are a lot of visitors coming. And there's just yesterday, there was a report from New York Times suggesting that the outbreak was essentially brought to the city by the visitors from Europe.
And not from Asia, not from China, but from Europe.
Not from China, actually. Because President Trump imposed these travel restrictions on people coming from China on January 31st, but no restrictions on people coming from Europe. So the virus began to circulate in the New York area by mid-February. That was weeks before the first confirmed cases were identified. And that actually makes sense because, you know, as we lived in the New York area in February, pretty much we have there were no outbreaks. There were no confirmed, really, like we're wondering why there was other places already seeing this confirmed cases, outbreaks, but not in New York. So that makes sense now because according to the data from the New York City Emergency Department, the surveillance data suggested that the outbreak actually started in March. So if you have the virus began to circulate in the New York area by mid-February, so it makes sense you're seeing actually sudden the increase of the cases in March.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Briefly talk about domestic American politics. Governor Cuomo, the New York governor, is doing very well, not least on his daily press shows, I can almost say, while Trump also gives a daily press show, but somehow it doesn't seem to go down quite as well. So is Cuomo someone who is going to challenge Biden for being the nominee of the Democratic Party?
Well, I think certainly, right, Governor Cuomo has demonstrated leadership in New York's fight against the COVID-19. But and then in the meantime, you've seen that the Democratic presidential candidate or hopeful, depends on how you view it. Joe Biden seems to be staying at home. There's really, because there's mass distancing measures, couldn't get his voice out and did not have that chance to show the leadership. But I doubt that Governor Cuomo is going to challenge his candidacy status simply because I think it's a little bit too late, I think.
Thank you. And both Trump and Biden are, of course, in the high-risk group, so they should both stay at home, don't you think? And self-isolate.
Well, but this still, President Trump has all these chances to tweet, to show his leadership, that he has indeed. He's since since March 11th when he since March 13th, I'm sorry, when he issued the state of emergency, he has demonstrated this, well, to be fair, the leadership in containing the spread of the virus in terms of invoking the Defense Production Act in terms of coordinating the different departments in responding to the outbreak, sending hospital ships, to the disease-affected areas, negotiating with, not negotiate sometimes, asking those the companies to repurpose the to making those PPEs, I think, well, even though it still is sometimes, doing something we think is kind of very idiosyncratic, but overall, I think he's performing much better than before March 13th.
Thank you. Dianne, is that a perception which is widespread in the UK as well, that Trump's ratings are going up because of the crisis?
Interesting, Klaus, because I think I spoke to you about this before. That initially in this crisis, it was very evident that the British press and certainly the opposition parties were quite restrained in how they treated the Boris Johnson administration, and it seemed as if all their bile was reserved for Trump, and he was really being attacked, and that's really gone in the last week, and indeed they really celebrated the way in which he'd offered individual help to Boris when he was in hospital. We'll fly over our team of doctors because, as was pointed out earlier, he's not been offering help on an international basis and certainly hasn't offered any leadership. The other interesting thing over here, with regard to what's happening in America, that sort of anti-Chinese drum, since Trump has more openly attacked China on that international basis, not just as the origin of the virus, you see precisely the same thing happening here. And again, it contrasts with what was really quite balanced coverage in the beginning. So yes, there was criticism of China covering up, and there was a lot of emphasis about the whistleblowers and how they'd been dismissed, and the Chinese doctor that died. But then there was also acknowledgement that China was helping other countries, was sharing its knowledge, sharing its experience, reaching out, etc. So that was all there. But certainly, and again, it's very much in the Conservative Party. People coming out and saying, "Well, look, it might have helped, but this is an influence operation, only intended to advance Chinese ambitions in the international arena." So it is quite disturbing, that sort of turnaround and very negative attitude that you're getting towards China. And of course, this sort of discourse can lead to repercussions on what is a very large and very well integrated Chinese population here, as we saw with the racist Brexit retort. These are dangerous games to play. There was another a point when you asked about global cooperation, and you mentioned what was going on in Europe. If you compare, I mean, the big thing over here was Gordon Brown came out and said,
the former Prime Minister,
global cooperation. Now, of course, Gordon Brown was the one that was able to mobilize people back in 2008 when we had the economic crisis. So you would think that would have given him some authority and gravitas, but that was a one-day news item, and that's gone, because of course we already know that this administration certainly doesn't want to cooperate with Europe. You know, when there was a chance to be part of procurement to get things that we now know we badly needed, the influence of the European Research Group on the Tory leadership was such that we couldn't even. We haven't technically really left the European Union yet, and then there was all sorts of attempts here to cover that up, because obviously this was equipment that we badly needed. So there remains, because of the Brexit process, very much like America first, or Britain first, and the global leadership that Brown successfully and effectively, you could argue, was able to mobilize before. That's not there. And one other thing that I got, because over here everybody's saying precisely what you brought up there about Andrew Cuomo. He should be the next president. But if you actually look at what Cuomo is doing, he's simply being transparent. He's being competent, and you know, he looks as if he's doing his best, whereas you know, really, that's what we should expect from all of them. He shouldn't look like some sort of outstanding leader that should be leading the free world simply because he seems to be doing a better job. I think it just highlights how awful leadership is in most of the places.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. A good point you make there. Manlio, what about the perception of both the United States and China and Italy? Have the Italians become less or more pro-China and less pro-American because of the crisis?
Yes. Well, this is an interesting point, because actually this is the point that Kaiser was making at the very beginning. We were the second country on the row, and we were the first to make the same mistake. Basically, we were just thinking that this was happening in China, was something far. And actually, the things went actually more badly. You know, there were reports about this being obviously the outcome of bad results of dietary habitudes in China and so on. So the thing was getting a sort of, let's say, a sort of xenophobic flavor, and trying to say that something was nothing about us. And then when the thing came in, obviously the first reaction were anti-Chinese. So saying, oh, this is something that was important. In a certain sense, we did what the US with Trump did, but we did it before. So it was very important, particularly from the symbolic view, to see that we received China help afterwards. So I wouldn't be able to know how much economically that helps count. It was, papers talk about 4 tons of health materials, so all the kind of uniforms. There was also in this country the big issue about masks to cover from viruses which were missing in the country because we don't produce anymore the masks. And China brought millions of these masks in the country, and they brought in also a team of doctors with the Red Cross from China coming in immediately in the country. So this, I wouldn't be able to count it and to weight it in economic terms, but definitely was a huge symbolic turn, and it turned completely the sort of perception that there was between the two countries. We should also say that Italy, since at least 1 year, has started to have a sort of a more open relationship with China. At the time of the 5G, there were other things going on, but Italy has taken, particularly with the 5 Stars government, a sort of a more open to China attitude. So the fact that we received this help was extremely important. As regards the US, I think that it's not just the US. Whenever the Italian public could see whatever Johnson said about the immunity, of general immunity, and then it was more or less before or later repeated by other leaders, not only by Trump, but by many other leaders, the last one in Sweden, in order of time. I think that for us, for Italians, was a matter of really, really difficult to understand how countries so well plugged into Western life could not even realize what was happening just across the Alps, in case of France or Germany, and then never mind for the US. So it was quite astonishing to see the leading country in the world, first, not realizing at all what was happening just across the Atlantic, and second, whenever they realized it, just to see the US was not playing any sort of role on that. So you see the Chinese coming in, but you see very little leadership actually being brought by what should be the historical leaders and the historical helpers. So it's a very, very difficult situation and very new to understand, you know, because I repeat, this is a completely overturned by comparison to what we usually expect.
Thank you very much. A final question to Kaiser before we open it up to written questions from the audience. Kaiser, what is the standing of Xi Jinping? Has it developed, has it changed, or is it just the same as before the crisis, or will there be repercussions on his leadership?
It's hard to really know. We don't have anything like social science polling data on that. I think that this is one of the eternal questions. It's hard to find levels of regime support generally, although I think anecdotally we're all pretty much aware that it remains very, very high. There are social scientists who have tried to sort of account for things like censorship and still come to a good number for the percentage of people who support the regime. And the impact of the coronavirus, I think, is also hard to determine. Now, if I had to wager on this, I would certainly say that he's come off better and not worse than this, from this. And I think that probably most people in my field would agree that that's the case. I think that maybe we should ask Yanzhong what his opinion is. I mean, my sense, though, is very much that rather than this having become a real crippling blow to his legitimacy, it has, if anything, enhanced it.
Yanzhong, do you agree?
Yeah, well, that's what but this is the actual the message I want to convey in my presentation.
Right.
I think he's sort of emerged out of this crisis sort of as a winner, at least for now. Though it is, you know, I have to point out that it doesn't mean he doesn't have any rivals. You know, certainly he has those people who are challenging his leadership. You know, has legitimacy. You might read that report that that Ren Zhiqiang, who's the Taekwondo billionaire in China, he was now being investigated simply because he published a letter publicly challenging Xi's leadership.
Thank you very much. Will, can I give over to you and you briefly explain to the audience how to ask a question, and then you select questions and read the questions aloud, please.
They've already been flowing in. Anybody with further questions can send them to all panelists in the chat. Unfortunately, you can't send them directly to me. I have a list now that we can start with.
Yes.
And some of these have been touched on just organically in the conversation, so I'll start the ones that haven't. David Litt asked for you to please discuss potential future threats to Europe, US, and China of exponential growth of novel coronavirus in Africa in the coming months. He said he recalls that in 2013, Ebola in West Africa spread uncontrolled in Lagos, Dakar, and other large cities. And Ebola is, of course, far less dangerous than the coronavirus. So does this present a threat?
Maybe Yanzhong and Kaiser could address that. Yanzhong?
Do you want to you want to go first, please?
Well, Kaiser, why don't you be the first?
Sure, okay. I think that this is where we should all be looking right now. We should all be painfully aware that our ignorance about the spread of it in the global south, if you consider China to be a part of that, was bad enough. The places we should look right now are the Indian subcontinent and to sub-Saharan Africa. It is going to get very, very, very bad. These are places which so far are less globalized. There's less inflow of people, and that's probably all that has spared them from large-scale devastation right now. But the capacity, not just the capacity in terms of ICUs per capita, not just in terms of just sort of the availability of healthcare, but the governing capacity of these countries. And that really is the determining factor in how good responses have been, is just in the capacity to govern. This is what is going to make these countries particularly vulnerable. And this is where we should be looking. We should be looking at Nigeria very, very heavily. We should be looking at Kenya. We should be looking at all the populous states. Remember what the AIDS crisis did, especially to Southern Africa. Ebola, yes, was different, but Ebola stands out to me as a shining example of U.S.-Chinese healthcare cooperation. That was a fantastically well-coordinated effort that both China and Beijing and Washington both contributed to. We should hold that up as an example, and this is the time for both countries to step up. China has a very keen interest in sort of improving, even more than it already has, its own sort of soft power perception in Africa. It is heavily invested in Africa, as probably all of you are aware.
Thank you. Shinjo.
So just I agree with Kaiser. Just want to mention that I think for many of those what we call low capacity states, I say indeed they here face a dilemma, right? On the one hand, you have this issue of governance capacity, right? Just Kaiser alluded to, and also they have this problem of the lack of, the mass testing capacity, right? So you really don't have a clear idea of how the virus spread in your country. And very likely this is only going to be reflecting on the rising, death tolls. But in the meantime, if you obtain that, even though you obtain that mass testing capacity, right, you have seen the cases continue to rise. That would only highlight how incompetent, how lack of capacity the leaders are. So this would itself also pose a challenge to their governance capacity and legitimacy. So, for now, I think before those mass testing capacities become available, before the vaccine become widely available, I think consciously or unconsciously would be rely on this what we call herd immunity. That allow the citizens, people to getting exposed to the virus. That's some certainly will die, some, but most of them will be recovered, especially considering that in Africa, you have a relatively younger population. Only 5% of the people are elderly people. So I don't know. Maybe who knows? Maybe they will emerge as in a better shape in Europe or the United States.
Thank you very much. Will, would you like to read the next question to us?
Yes, so I have a related question, and it involves, of course, the last few global pandemics, including SARS, H1N1, MERS, have hit the Western world, Europe, and North America much less significantly than, as Kaiser mentioned, the global South. Has this influenced public opinion and government opinion in the West and kind of led them to develop the delusion that the West is immune to pandemics?
Maybe Manlio or Dianne?
Well, I think one of the things I mentioned in my paper is that Western governments were made aware of these threats. And actually in Ireland in 2014 and in Britain in 2016, the governments actually looked at this. So they knew that possibility existed, but they made a choice not to provide the sort of capacity that would be needed. They were prepared to stand those losses. Now, I don't think that they really thought the losses would be as great as they are. And I think this is the sort of debate that's worriedly being opened up now. What sort of losses are you prepared to have? And some parts of this debate with some people are really quite disturbing. I mean, we've had disabled people coming on and people who have a variety of illnesses and saying that all of a sudden they feel they're not as of much value to society. So it's not simply whether or not we're threatened physically by disease, but some of the attitudes that are arising, and it's precisely what was mentioned earlier, that there seems to be this vague hope that because of community spirit and what have you, they're learning to pull together and we'll come out of this a better world. But there seem to be some very frightening opportunities for the right. And of course, the economic impact will give them the justification. Yes, we weren't prepared and we didn't have the capacity, but we've spent all this money dealing with the pandemic. So now back to austerity, back to abandoning the poor.
Thank you. Maybe we have another question, Will?
If I can...
Oh, you want to come? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, please.
No, if I can adapt, perhaps expand a bit on this, I mean, on the same line of Dianne. It's incredible how we cannot learn and from each other and how we are slow, picking up, there was the example of Ebola before, but now even with the coronavirus, which was Westerner, we took so much time to learn from each other. I think that is not a surprise that national publics and national debates, particularly in Europe, we know this very well, we are confined because of the different languages, because of the different countries. So in a certain sense, it is not so surprisingly that one country doesn't look too much to another country, but traditionally the political leadership was supposed to have that role. But nowadays, and now I'm expanding a bit, but nowadays political leadership are very much interested only in electoral results. And we've seen this particularly in the last rounds of election in many countries across Europe, particularly in Italy, that the leadership is just running behind continuous surveys of what the public and what is the mood about, just to serve the best dishes that people would like. And in a certain sense, this, I think, it's linked to the lateness, to the delay that countries have in understanding what is the best solution, what is the best road that you take at a certain moment. Whenever you are too much confined and you are not capable to vision beyond, well, that's when the limitation of political leadership comes. And I think that coronavirus is actually teaching us.
Thank you. There are many questions coming in, And I would like to emphasize that what we are doing now, our discussion now and the presentations before, we are recording these and they will be put on our YouTube channel. So if you miss any of the presentations or any of the comments, then you can see that within a few days on our YouTube channel. One question struck me by a lady who is in the UK and whose children are still in China and she can't go and see her children. She asked quite understandably, when will travel between Europe and China, travel between the US and China and the US and Europe, when will that be taken up again by normal airlines? Any speculation about that?
I think, I'm afraid there would only be speculation. China actually only imposed the visa ban at the very end of March. And so it's only been a little more than a week. It seems like a very long time now, but they are, it's just impossible to say right now. I think they're going to watch the situation as it develops. I feel very, very bad for Samantha who asked the question. All I can say is I'll continue to play you in Scrabble online. We've been having a number of games, and I didn't realize this situation with your children, and I feel terribly bad about it.
And the bad thing is, of course, that the likelihood of being put into quarantine for 2 weeks, even if you manage to travel to China, is quite high. And that has actually happened to some of our Chinese students who went back from the US to China, and all of them were put into kind of nice quarantine, I understand. You know, they got nice food and everything, but it still meant they had to be isolated for 2 weeks.
That's
which
right.
is a bit like a prison sentence, you know, maybe not quite as bad, but still, it's not nice. Will, do you have another good question for us?
Yes. So a lot of people have been asking, and this would be best for Dianne, how COVID-19 is impacting the Brexit process and how it may in the future.
Oh, right. Ideologically, I remember Boris was, he was going to get Brexit done. And that's what I meant by the slogans that he uses. So there's a lot of emphasis. And remember, the relationship between Europe and Britain did deteriorate greatly on our side. And a lot of hubris and a lot of things being said. And the British public, on the whole, still feel we're better out of Europe. We have to get out of Europe, and that's what Boris promised. And he will be concerned, the Tory party will be concerned about their electoral prospects. And a lot of people who voted for them did so because they promised Brexit. So that is going to be an influence. Now, what we do know is that in the background, the people who are negotiating are still negotiating, but they're Skyping. But obviously there's a pandemic going on. There are all sorts of concerns. The European negotiators had already said that trying to get it done in the time frame that the British wanted was virtually impossible. And whether or not, I mean, there's been nothing said that there will be a delay. And actually, where the focus is at present is who asks for an extension. Because remember, the Tory government have enshrined in law that there cannot be an extension. So there's criticism here of the European Union, saying the European Union should be offering an extension. They shouldn't want us to ask for an extension because we don't want one, but if you offer us, or we don't want to ask for one. So it's not straightforward. It still is an issue that has divided the country, that has been very, very damaging. And for the Tory party, there's a section of the Tory party that are very ideologically driven, but also very influential on the Tory leadership, and they will want to get Brexit done. And it doesn't matter about the cost. So I wouldn't guarantee that the pandemic will slow down the process. And there is that hubris. We don't want the Tory leadership will not want to ask for an extension. So we're sort of like, I guess, hoping that Europe will offer us one.
Thank you very much. Talking about the cost, Brian Keelev asks, what about the economic consequences, both for the US, for China, and also for Europe? Will we see something like the Great Recession, or perhaps even worse, and some economists have predicted that there will be another Great Depression. Is that likely to happen? Manlio, what do you think?
Well, I think it's, for certain countries, this is clear that there is a huge risk. It's definitely clear for Italy, for Spain, also for France. In Italy, Italy is a country that traditionally has a huge debt, has a huge public debt of, at the moment, 135% on the GDP. And they calculate, economists calculate already the next year we rise to 155% of the GDP. So that's why I was saying that for us, reaching a deal at European level with some recovery bonds or Eurobonds or coronavirus bond, or in any case, to have a sort of plan at European level, it's vital. Because without this happening, there is no doubt that there will be a collapsing at the economic level, because at 155% of debt on the GDP means that you wouldn't be able to finance your debt with national government bonds, because obviously the interest rates that you would need to pay would be too high and you wouldn't be able to repay for that. So basically, I don't know if we are leading to that direction, but definitely getting back to my previous point, if political leadership now is not capable to act, that's definitely the end where we are going, particularly in certain countries. And then we know very well that the beginning of economic decline in some countries would lead to economic decline in other countries, particularly in an integrated economic space like Europe. But just to answer the question, very briefly, I think that there is no doubt that this is the big risk, but for some countries more than for others.
There's speculation that by the end of this month, there will be 20 million unemployed in America, which is a rate of something like 15%. This is enormous. This cannot but have deep repercussions on the US national economy. Kaiser, how do you see that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you'd have to be quite stupid not to recognize the enormity of this impact. I mean, look, last week we had 7 million jobless claims in the United States. This is unprecedented. This has never happened before, not even in the Great Depression. This is a really catastrophic economic event. You have both of the world's major economies, I mean, China and the United States, and you have the EU now. Between the three of them, that's over 50% of the global GDP. I mean, and all of them are in, I mean, it's not just recession. This is a depression.
Yes. And also, I'm quite surprised that no one seems to worry too much where the government actually gets the money from and how much that pushes up the debt of the United States. And of course, also in Europe, the debt of various European countries, the debt of the Chinese nation. In the UK, they're even thinking about really printing money, not just lending money from the international money markets. Of course, they have to pay that back, and that would burden the debt burden of the country. But they're actively thinking of asking the Bank of England to simply give them the money by starting off the printing presses.
To my earlier point about the importance of US-China relations, let's just not forget who shows up at the T-bill auctions to buy all of that American debt, and who has been doing that for the last 20 years.
Absolutely.
Can I just, I mean, I'm not an economist by any means, but I do remember the 2008 crash, and I remember the debates about that. And I've heard similar debates, not on mainstream British TV, on other sources, but obviously the 2008 crash, the deliberate choice was to bail out the banks. So the money went to the banks, and et cetera, all the various things we know. But there were economists then and there are economists now saying the way to save the world economy, if you will, is not to put money into more and more corporations and banks, etc., but is to give it to the people at the bottom, to populations at large, because these are the very people that will spend it, because they have to spend it, because they have to live, and that will be a stimulus to the economy. So there's a solution that's quite radical that capitalist governments possibly don't want to consider, but it might be that we have to.
So Trump is right by sending checks to the ordinary people of America.
Yes, but actually, yes, he is. But the problem here, it's the same with the British government. People are saying, isn't this wonderful? Look how much they're prepared to give. But if you look at these packages that they're providing at the moment and you compare it with what was provided to the banks back in 2008, it is peanuts. If you really want to stimulate the economy and if you really want people to stay at home, then you've got to give them substantial amounts. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, what's Trump giving people? $1,200? Now, if you live in a poor part of America, in a ghetto, that might pay your rent for a week or two. But if you live in an affluent place, they're probably not even going to pay your rent for half a week.
But
so
they won't get the $1,200 in the first place.
I mean,
No.
if it works the way it's in America, the way it's working in Britain, the money isn't getting through anywhere. People need it. The people at the bottom, they really need it now. So we have yet to see the money that's promised. And you know, I listen to quite a few chat shows locally, and when you see the daily press conferences with government officials, they talk about what marvels they have done and who they're giving the money to. But when you listen to local radio, small businesses are coming on and saying, we haven't got anything yet. And if we, you know, we're not going to survive to the end of the week.
Okay, thank you.
If I can add up on this, Klaus, it's a vision from Europe on the US. It's quite surprising because I agree with what Dianne just said. But it's also true that what is surprising is that the United States is not protecting the jobs. So I understand that the money should go in the lower part of the population so that they can spend money. But whereas, for example, in Germany, but also in Italy, in many countries of Europe, typically you would have this economic help going so that people retain their job. So typically they would be paid 60-70% of their full salary, but their job would be frozen so that they can come back to the job whenever the crisis is over. In the US, what is surprising from the European viewpoint is to see that there is money to do things, there is big money to do things, but it's just thought in unemployment benefits. So you accept the fact that people are losing their jobs, and then you just give them the money so that they can pay rent or food or whatever. But these people, whenever the crisis is over, will not have their jobs back. So this is quite surprising from the European viewpoint.
Well, there is an attempt by the American government to do something like that as well, not to have people made unemployed, but furloughed, and the money, 80% will be covered by the American government. But I understand that it's not being taken up as widely as it is in Europe, but I think, to be fair, the attempt is being made. Let me suggest to Will to ask perhaps two final questions. There was a scientific question which you would like to pose, and then I would say we have a final round where the remaining speakers, some of our speakers had to leave, will address a final overarching question, please.
Okay, so the scientific question is two parts, and it's, is this an important time for scientists to communicate interdisciplinarily with people who are not scientifically literate in order to form responses to the crisis? And how should leaders who aren't scientifically literate or educated decide how to react to information put forth by scientists?
Kaiser.
Yeah, so obviously, the preference would be that we actually do have leaders who are scientifically literate. This reminds me very much of that 1959 lecture by C.P. Snow, who's a physical chemist and a novelist, who's somebody, one of those rare individuals who straddled the two cultures. And this was the name of his famous lecture, which then became a book, The Two Cultures. I mean, I think many of us recognize, I'm sure Lisa is a perfect example of that. People who are trained in the natural sciences, who nevertheless can hold their own in discussions about literature or history. Maybe they don't know all the ridiculous theory, but they're literate in our fields. But few of us, who are the social scientists and the people in the humanities, can claim literacy in science, and that is a tragedy. And that point is being driven home right now. In no position in society is more urgent than in our leadership. This is one thing that I actually do admire about the Chinese Communist Party leadership, is that until very recently, at least, it was so heavily dominated by people who were trained, who had four-year degrees in the natural sciences or in engineering, who were scientifically literate. I mean, this is one of the things that's holding us back right now. Look at the idiotic debates that are happening in the United States about, I mean, it's just crazy that we do not have the kind of deference to expertise and scientists and science that we really ought to have. This is, we are reaping the whirlwind of populism right now, and this willful ignorance that is such a hallmark of the American polity in so many crucial moments. So yeah, that's look, I think that it's a failure of our educational systems also, that we do not require more grounding in science for people who graduate from good universities and do not have a basic grasp of actually how evolution works, who do, you know. So we find ourselves in these policy situations where we are relitigating the Scopes monkey trial. China and other countries do not have that problem.
Thank you, very true. Maybe we have another final question from Will, and then I'll ask the very final question. We are running out of time already.
Yes, yeah, so the US is still trying to manage the coronavirus domestically. How or in what ways should the US cooperate or help globally without risking neglecting or making matters worse at home?
Who would like to address that?
I just went, so somebody else.
I mentioned earlier about Gordon Brown, and we mentioned earlier as well about the Chinese and where they actually did try to respond globally and help people. And something that's not mentioned at all is Cuba. As you know, Cuba did send doctors to Italy, but Cuba has always sent doctors and medical support to the poorest countries in the world. And that's where that support will be coming from now. Because their health infrastructures are so dire. But I think the reality is going to be that this is a global pandemic and you can't put it right in one country. And as anti-intellectual as both the US and the UK are, and their reluctance usually to listen to experts, even people's own common sense will tell them, unless you want to be a fortress country that nobody can leave and nobody can come into, you can't solve this crisis nation by nation.
Mm-hmm. Manlio, would you like to address that?
Yes, I think it's a very important point, and I think that it makes us reflecting really at the international level. The reality is that since the US has decided to withdraw from Europe, and this has been clear and visible and outcried in the discourse of Trump, what happened is that there was room for others to come in. So I think that whenever we think about China, but also Russia that we didn't mention, there were actually in the north of Italy, there are what they're called experts from Russia. There are, I think, about 120 military service people that they came in the north of Italy. And there is actually a huge row at the moment, because one journalist from a very famous La Stampa newspaper in the north of Italy actually accused these agents from Moscow to be just spies or other people who are in Italy for some other reasons. And actually the speaker for the defense of Russia actually said that he got a very bad, I wouldn't be able to translate it in English, but something like a bad pennies always return back. The idea that he should really be mind about the way that he speaks to these journalists, because you never know what's going to happen. So this was a big threat directly from Russia. But this is just to say that Russia, Cuba, China, now I'm not taking a position to say whether these helps were more strategically orientated, more malicious or not. But the fact is, also because I'm not knowledgeable enough to take a stand on that, but the fact is that with the withdrawing of the US, what happened is that the international situation has changed. So a crisis like the coronavirus leaves open opportunities for other big powers getting into Europe and play a game that until very recently, just before Trump, would never be possible.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a final question. We are way over time, so we have to come to an end. I mean, for the last few years, there was a battle between globalization, the global order, the rules-based global order, and nationalism, including economic nationalism. And do you think the current crisis will push the victory to one or the other, or the other of these sides? How will, you know, what the world will look like in international cooperation terms? How will that be influenced, maybe decisively, by the current corona crisis? Kaiser, do you want to go? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think that if I had to sort of predict a scenario, a likely scenario, it would be one in which in the short term, the economic nationalists win, that we emerge from this with them you know, sort of even pushing harder on this, on economic nationalism, which, you know, would be coupled with all sorts of ugly sort of corollary beliefs about ethno-nationalism and whatnot. But that will produce still greater disasters, and that we will eventually find our good sense and realize that for all its problems, the more closely globally integrated world, that was a better vision. We can fix problems about unequal distribution of the fruits of that. We can fix a lot of the other things. We don't need to re-embrace total sort of unalloyed neoliberalism in order to you know, draw the benefits of closer global cooperation.
Thank you. Dianne, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing, I mean, we're talking about America withdrawing from world leadership, but in actual fact, Trump just has a very honest, if you will, way of asserting American leadership, whereas before it was we lead by consent. What Trump says is we lead by telling you what to do. It's economic sanctions or military might if you don't respond in the way that we want to maintain American primacy. And it's always been about American primacy. Whatever sort of leadership has been offered, it's been to the benefit of America. So it would have intervention wherever it felt intervention was in its interest, and it would support regimes regardless of their political makeup, so long as they did what they were told. Now, if you look at the sort of concerns that are being expressed about China and about Russia, and they're being opportunistic, what we need to remember is that these countries are already part of a global capitalist order. Communism is dead. We're not looking at these countries trying to ideologically push a different system on us. And what I think is, if you look at what they've really wanted, it's that we no longer have a unipolar world, which has been you know, since the end of the Cold War. That's what we've had, a unipolar world. What they have been arguing for is a multipolar world, where if you will, other powers can have some sort of say in the sort of world order that goes forward. And I don't think that would be such a bad thing. I think that these are countries that have other things to offer. They have their dark sides, but if we had a multipolar world where everybody cooperates, I think there might be a way forward. And what the political complexion of that world will be, we'll have to see. But hopefully people at the bottom will realize that they need to be active. They can't just sit back and consume and watch YouTube and worry about shopping all the time.
Thank you.
And hopefully this pandemic will have made them realize that there are more important things.
Okay, a call for being active. Thanks very much. Manlio.
Well, I think it's such a huge question. It's very difficult to answer, but I think that Dianne is right for so many things, in the sense that But at the same time, it's very difficult to understand whether a global capitalism is fitting better or not a multipolar world. What I'm trying to say is that the political shape is still at stake. It may well be that the multipolar world politically is a good means to balance global capitalism, as it may not be. But without entering this, which I think requires too much of a big debate, the fact is that the two visions have been opposing each other in the last 10, 15 years, particularly in the last 10, as we know, and as the thing stands, we had, now once again, I focus on Europe, the finance crisis, the economic crisis, and then with the refugee crisis that we didn't mention, and now we have the coronavirus crisis. And every single time these two big poles, they come against the other. Now, I don't know who's winning at the end, but I think that the post-national approach is being injured. Every single time it's been injured more badly. And there are big losses. I mean, I think that for Brexit, from a post-national perspective, looking at the European level, it was a big defeat from whoever believes in that perspective. It was a huge defeat. And that was the outcome of the finance and refugee crisis. Now the coronavirus comes and we may have other big losses. We may have Italy out, why not? And this means that the project is still there, it resists. It seems to resist every single time to huge shocks, but the costs are big. So I don't know how it ends, but it's a very bleeding situation. So.
Thank you very much, Manlio. Dave just wrote in, said, as far as the US is concerned, it all depends on November. And I guess there is some truth to that. I would like to thank Will and Paul for their technical support. Thank you very much. Then I would, of course, like to thank our participants and speakers. There's Dianne Kirby from Belfast. There's Manlio Cinalli from Milan. Here's Kaiser Kuo from Chapel Hill. And there was Lisa Gralinski and Yanzhong Huang from New York and from Chapel Hill. So thank you very much for coming to our event on the Corona crisis today. And I think the general lesson we learned is that we really need further and more global cooperation to overcome the crisis and to overcome the severe repercussions of this crisis, particularly in the economic and social sphere. Thank you very much for all of you. Thank you very much for the many viewers globally, which we had, quite a few from the United States, but also quite a few from Asia and from Europe. So thank you very much for joining us today. I would like to say that there might be another Krasno event online in a week or 2 weeks' time. We still have to think about that and organize that. So I will let you know by our famous mailing list. And if you wish to come and hop onto our mailing list, then please write to me and you will get all the information about our exciting new events. And last but not least, this event today, including every minute of it, will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days' time. Thank you very much again for joining us today, and have a good night everywhere.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.